Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of agape relationships in the Old Testament. I just want to remind you, we've spent 2 sessions talking about how we can even describe agape as a key word in the Old Testament. And we've given the history of the Septuagint translation. We've also talked about the 4 Greek words that were in common use for love and their different nuances and where we find them or not, or where we don't find them in the Bible. Um, and what we're going to do today is visit that first place where the word agape is used in the Bible, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And so we'll have to open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 22. This is the simplest Hebrew in all the Old Testament. When you take Hebrew course in Christian college or something, and you spend the first semester, learning the basics and building a little bit of a vocabulary, and then at the end of the first semester, you get to read a snippet of scripture, and then your sense of accomplishment is so enormously high because you've opened the Hebrew Bible and you've read it in Hebrew. And so you have to go to the place where the language is the simplest. And if you're taking New Testament Greek, you go to John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Simple vocabulary, short sentences, profound thought, but very simple. And when you take Hebrew, or at least when I took it 40 plus years ago, this is where you go. And I think even in English, we get the sense that the language here is as simple as see spot run or go dog go. It just is, it's as simple as children's literature in terms of its vocabulary and syntax. And yet, as profound as any passage in all the Bible. And it's the first time agape is used. See if you can spot it. Genesis 1, 22, excuse me. I'm going to read verses 1 through 8. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham? And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. And so Abraham rose in the morning and saddled his donkey and took of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. And on the third day Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder, and we will worship, and we will return to you. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked on together. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and said, My father? And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for burnt offering, my son. And the two of them walked on together. This is such an important passage. Um, of course, Isaac is going to be put on the altar, and Abraham's going to raise the knife. Um, it's a great act of faith on Abraham's part. Is the ultimate act of faith on Abraham's part, which we know from the book of Genesis, but also from the New Testament. But also an act of faith on Isaac's part, because Isaac is not a little boy; he's a youth. The same word is used to describe him as is used to describe the servants, the lads that Abraham took with him. So he's at least 12, one would think, maybe as old as 16, 17 years old. He is not a Yeladim, he is a Na'arim. He's an adolescent, in other words. He's a young man. And of course his dad is nearly 120. So you think you could take him if he wanted to, but no, he's quite obedient to his father and yields to what his father is going to do. So it's a great act of faith on the part of both of them. I think the best book written about this episode is by Soren Kierkegaard, his little volume, Fear and Trembling, where he traces the path of Abraham's faith. And he says, when God told Abraham, leave your country to a place I will show you, that is irrational. It doesn't make sense. But Abraham did it. His faith caused him to do the irrational. And God said to Abraham, you're 100 and your wife is 90, but go in and father a child. The two of you, go get your 90-year-old wife pregnant and have a child. That was impossible. Romans 4, his body was as good as dead, and yet he did this because of his faith. But when he asked him, go sacrifice your son, that's absurd. Because human sacrifice has always been against the will of God. Always, 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 always. And this is the child of promise and the child of miracle. And God says to go offer him as a sacrifice, and that's absurd. And yet, Abraham does it. And Abraham has confidence that he's not going to lose his son, no matter what happens on the mountain. God has given him a little bit of comfort in that he says, as he said at the very beginning, go to the place I will show you. It's almost like God is saying to Abraham, you stuck with me this far. It's been okay. So you can trust me on this one. But he gives him no other explanation than to say, go to the place I will show you. But we know Abraham has confidence because Abraham says to the young men, I'm going to take my son, we're going to go over here, we're going to worship, and we are both coming back to you. I don't think he means that Isaac is going to come back as a corpse. In fact, the Old Testament in Hebrews chapter 11 says that Abraham was able to do this because he imagined that God was able to raise the dead. And no one's ever been raised before. This is beyond human experience. And yet he was able to imagine it because of his faith. Faith thus was like a sense, like sight and hearing and smell. It helped him perceive the world and to be able to comprehend what he couldn't with his other senses. Faith is thus a sense, and it's in a very real way. And the first time that the word agape is used is here, because this prefigures what God is going to do for us. This is John 3:16, lived by a human being, someone who loved their son, but who gave that son a sacrifice so that God's plan could take place, so that God's commands could be obeyed. And that's where we meet this word for the first time. God, who is love, says to Abraham, and he identifies Isaac 4 ways. Take your son, that's one. Your only son, the monogenes, your only begotten son. It's not his only son. He's got Ishmael, but it's his only son of promise. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, and then who you love. I'm asking you to take the thing which is the object of your agape and sacrifice it because I told you so. And Abraham does. And of course, he doesn't have to sacrifice his son. And of course, this is the final seal on the covenant that is our covenant with God, the covenant of Abraham, so that our faith will give us the inheritance of that covenant that God made with Abraham to bless all of the world through his offspring, meaning, of course, Jesus. Okay, well, that's the first instance of agape being used in the Bible. The next time we're together, we're going to stay with the patriarchs, and we're going to look at Isaac and Rebekah and their relationship. Thank you so much for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.